This is the introduction to the civil rights movement. You have to first complete this assignment here, which is going to reference issues from the 1870s. I'm going to first look at this social model, which looks at the vicious cycle. And the vicious cycle usually starts out with prejudice, discrimination. These are small-scale examples that could be like the individual making a decision to be prejudicial or discriminatory, whereas social disadvantages are more big institutions. This is an image from the Dahl case, and in the Dahl case, the NAACP was able to prove that segregation led to a belief in inferiority by using white and black dolls and asking black children questions like which doll is good and which doll is bad, because the children answered at such an early age that the black doll was associated with negativity. That proved that there was a belief in inferiority. The question here is whether or not other groups can be placed into the vicious cycle. So here I have a comparison to white Americans. Do white Americans experience prejudice, discrimination, social disadvantages? An example often used could be affirmative action. So you want to keep these models in mind as we proceed through this unit on the civil rights movement. The pyramid of hate, we've addressed this a couple of times, and I would say that the social disadvantages fall here, whereas the prejudice and discrimination fall in this particular category. For our classwork or homework, we're looking at the South and how the South after the Civil War is split up into these military districts to make sure that the 13th through 15th Amendments were being followed. The South views this as an intrusion of federal government laws on their state laws, and this is what's going to ultimately lead to the states' rights argument. Here we see a similar map, and again, this is viewed as the federal government overstepping their power and abusing their power. You could think about this image here, where the federal government is trying to force feed legislation down the throats of the state. These three amendments here are viewed as federal legislation after the Civil War that frees the slaves, guarantees equal citizenship, and then voting. So when you think of the poll tax and literacy test, those are all loopholes around the 15th Amendment because the South refuses to comply. Again, the South is going to view this as an example of force feeding legislation down the throats of the states and overstepping the power. In this election here, the 1876 election removes those districts as a result of these three states claiming to have an electoral college dispute, and the agreement was that these three states would give their electoral votes to Hayes on the condition that he removes those districts, and that is going to lead to Plessy-Ferguson. This is all about loopholes around the law, and then our approach to the civil rights movement is going to be to look at it from either the federal or states governments and going back and forth as they try to find loopholes around the legislation. For this task, you're going to look at segregation laws, and you want to follow these prompts here. And we're trying to point out, I guess, the pettiness and the role of race, as well as the amount of laws that were designed to maintain segregation. 14th Amendment. Here we have a segregation law from the state of Georgia, and I'm going to be pointing that out because it is an example of the local and state governments fighting against the federal governments. Is this a violation of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment? Possibly the 14th Amendment, depending on how you interpret this section. For this task, you're going to try to find a loophole around the law, pretending you are a circus promoter. This is in the state of Louisiana, and this is a law involving circus tickets. So what's going on here is you have the law is saying that you need to have 25 feet apart for the circus booths if you're selling two races. If you were to place two circus tickets sellers in one booth, you would be in violation of the previous law. So the goal here is you need to have 25 feet distance, and again, we're trying to point out the pettiness in the law. Here we have a law involving intermarriage, and it's a good example of a loophole, because here they're saying you cannot intermarry, which then I guess people found a loophole because they started living together, which then prompted the state of Florida to pass a cohabitation law. And I guess the goal here is to separate the races. We're going to be looking at a couple of scenarios here, and what I want you to do is look at the law and look at the plaintiff as well as the defendant and determine whether or not they have an actual case and if this is a violation of anybody's rights. You can also determine the possible arguments regarding the case. In this particular scenario here, you have a nurse we have the law from the state of Alabama, and it's whether or not the administration can direct her to take care of somebody from the opposite race. You need to determine who's in the right, who's in the wrong, who's in compliance of the law. In this scenario, the law from the state of North Carolina is arguing that you cannot give textbooks and interchange them. So you cannot have white books go to students of the black race, or however they phrase that racial description here. And here we have the plaintiff who is arguing that books were interchangeable, and he has an issue with it, so he is suing the school district. So you want to figure out who's in the right, who's in the wrong, who's in compliance of the law. In this scenario, you have a warden, and the warden has placed 2 prisoners into a jail cell, which is possibly a violation of this in the state of Mississippi. So if you have a white prisoner who is forced to be in a prison cell with a black individual, they might be in a position to sue you. So again, you want to figure out who is in the right, who is in the wrong, who is in compliance of the law. Here we have a scenario involving amateur baseball, and the issue here is that you have to have a 2-block gap between any people of different races playing baseball. Here you have a new development, and the developer is trying to develop this section, which forces the black field into within the 2-block radius. So here I have 1 block, and then I guess we have a 0.5 block, but they're supposed to be 2 blocks. That's supposed to be the gap, but because of this development, it's forced that baseball stadium into another area. Who is in compliance with the law? Who is not? In this scenario, we're looking at hospital entrances, exits, and here we have all of the exits on fire and entrances. If this individual uses the white exit, is he in violation of the law? Can he potentially get arrested? This scenario is about a barber. You cannot cut the hair of someone of the opposite race, especially if it involves a white woman or girl in the state of Georgia. If you are to direct a black barber to cut the hair of this white woman, who is in violation of the law? Is it this individual? Is it this individual? In this scenario, we're looking at a restaurant, and we're trying to figure out how to integrate. So what you want to do here is take the law, and you want to pretend that building this wall costs you money. If I were to build this wall with this door, am I in compliance of the law? What about this scenario here? Am I still in compliance? What is right? What is wrong with this scenario? How about this one here? Maybe you want to take a chance and try to develop yours, but I would argue you probably want to maintain the same amount of circle to square, and you want to keep in mind the entrance as well as the bathroom. Everything has to be equal. This is a method that I've used, seems to work, seems to be very complicated and costly for all parties involved. Scenario question: how would you segregate the internet? Do we have 2? Do you have 1 and it kind of routes people? I know it's absurd. And now we're going to be looking at a couple of other examples of federal and anti-federalist or states' rights, L plus S versus F. We have the series of laws that we've looked at already. Now we have some additional examples here. This one is going back to slavery. How about abortion? If the states have laws that are for abortion, the federal government has legislation that says yes to abortion, no to abortion. How is that going to impact the states? And keep in mind, it might be viewed as an example of the federal government telling the states what to do, hence Roe v. Wade. 2004 election, there was a debate about same-sex marriage, and in that particular debate, it was about the federal government trying to define marriage. If they passed it and said that gay marriage was allowed, it would be viewed as an example of the federal government overstepping and abusing its power. Transgender bathrooms, another example. Keep in mind, if there are going to be transgender separate bathrooms, this is going to be costly for all parties involved, but it would have to be about compliance of the law. If they do pass legislation, it would be an example of the federal government trying to tell the states what to do. How about DACA and immigration? Another example. This could be viewed if the federal government says we are going to force states to grant citizenship. That could be an issue, even though that's really not part of the argument that's being used here with regard to DACA. And segregation. Pretty much segregation, what I want you to take from this are a series of state laws, and the federal government, it's not until 1964 with the Civil Rights Act is going to pass legislation to deal with this issue and try to resolve it, which would be viewed as an example of force-feeding legislation down the throats of the state. States. And that's it.